These are the last days, no doubt about that. We've just read, starting in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, about this time of the end. And if you go through, actually I've coloured in, you might have also highlighted the references through to the end of chapter 12 of the end, the end, the end, the time of the end. And similar expressions as in verse 7, accomplished and finished. They're both the same word actually in the original. So when the scattering of the Jewish people is finished, then everything's going to start to finish. Start to finish? Yeah, that's probably the right expression, because the time of the end is a long period of time. It started a long time ago. As a matter of fact, it started 106 years ago in 1917. This is called in the Bible the time of the end. So it's not just the last few minutes of this world's existence, it's a period of time. As such as there was a period of time of the kingdom of God over Israel, from 1000 BC to the nominal period given in the scripture as 603 BC, the end of the time of the kingdom of Israel, we might say, kingdom of God over Israel. And then we've got the time of the kingdom of men, which we're going to see started in BC 603 with Nebuchadnezzar being called the head of gold, and running right through to 1917. And then came, as far as the scripture is concerned, the beginning of the time of the end, 1917. Well, these things that are happening in Israel now have a great relevance to what we're talking about today. I prepared my slides, finished them on Friday night, using some from talks that I've given before, and some new ones I added regarding Saudi Arabia and the prophecy in Joel chapter 3. And the prophecy in Joel chapter 3 is about to be fulfilled, as we shall see. That's near the end of the talk, but just have a quick look over in Joel chapter 3, because Joel chapter 3 talks about the Battle of Armageddon and the gathering of the nations to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And that starts in the first few verses and then continues on from verse 9. So you have in verse 2, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat and plead with them there for my people and my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. As I said, when we come to Daniel chapter 12, we talk about the end of the scattering being accomplished. So that he tells us that this time period is equivalent to the time period of Daniel 12. Joel chapter 3, gathering all nations. Notice in verse 1, God brings again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. The captivity of Judah, we could say, finished in 1948, when Israel was declared a nation. There's no more captivity of Judah since 1948. And then the captivity of Jerusalem ended in 1967 with the Six-Day War and the control of Jerusalem. So this is talking about that same time of the end period. And then sandwiched, let's go down to verse 9. Proclaim this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war come up. And you go down to verse 12, and we're told that they come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. So you've got those first few verses, and then from verse 9 on, continuing to talk about Armageddon. But sandwiched in between them, which must mean it happens at the same time as the gathering to Armageddon, are our verses 4 to 8. And I'm going to talk about this, as I said, more at the end, but notice in verse 4, what's it talking about? Tyre and Zidon and all the coasts of Palestine. Now, where's Tyre and Zidon today, geographically? What country is it? Lebanon. Did everybody say Lebanon? They did. Lebanon. Who's in charge of Lebanon, really? Hezbollah. Will they be called into this war? We don't know for sure. But here we have, what have you to do with me? Why are you doing things to my people? Tyre and Zidon. Who else? All the coasts of Palestine, which has got to be the Palestinians in Gaza, and the coast means the borders, which would include the West Bank as well. What are you doing to me and my people? The prophet says, in earlier times you rejoiced when my people were sent off into captivity. Matter of fact, you helped people take my people into captivity amongst the Grecians, it says, meaning the Gentiles, the Greek countries of Europe. They were scattered, and you were happy about that. But I'm going to bring my people back into their land. And when I raise them, verse 7, out of the place where you have sold them, I will return your recompense upon your own head. Rockets coming down from above. Your recompense is going to be returned on your own head. And then your people will be subject to what Israel wants to do with you. Tyre and Sidon and Palestine. What Israel wants to do with you. And what will Israel want to do with them? Sell them to the Sabaeans. Who are the Sabaeans? The people of Sheba, the Saudi Arabians and the Arab states in a similar area. So you are going to be sold into their control. Now, we don't know what that means, whether they'll actually be taken out of the land to Sabea, to Sheba, to Saudi Arabia, whether they'll be deported or what it will be. But whatever it is, this passage is telling us that Saudi Arabia will control the future of Lebanon and the Palestinians. Now, I'm going to come back to that. And why is that important to the present situation? It's important to the present situation because Saudi Arabia is on the cusp, said Benjamin Netanyahu, of making an agreement with Israel. And I'll show you a little video, some video clips later on about that. So we're getting very close to the Sabaeans taking control of what's happening in regard to the Palestinians and Lebanon. Now, when this latest, I'll call it a skirmish at the moment, and I think it's a lot more than that, and we don't know how long it's going to go for, but this war, as it's been declared, when it began on the basis that the Palestinians were saying, this is Hamas, the Palestinians in general, that we're fighting this war called the Operation Al-Aqas Flood. Now, Al-Aqsa, of course, is the mosque located on the Temple Mount, right alongside the Dome of the Rock, and right there where the temple was originally built, and where the Lord Jesus Christ will, when the geography is all changed, will make that the centre of the temple of the future age. So, them calling it that is basically telling us who know the scriptures, something's going to happen in regard to the Temple Mount. It's all coming to a head. The whole of the prophecy of Daniel and the time periods that we're going to be looking at this afternoon have to do with Jerusalem, and in particular, the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is really the centre of the subject of Daniel's prophecy. Jerusalem keeps on coming up again and again and again through Daniel's prophecy. When he's talking about time periods and the future, it's all about the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy, the holy city, the Temple Mount, we call it today. If you have a look at Daniel chapter 1, for example, and the first verse, you'll see that Daniel 1 mentions Jerusalem. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Then, as I said, right through the prophecy, you'll read of Daniel praying towards Jerusalem, prophecies about the events associated with Jerusalem, the 70-week prophecy to the time of the taking away of sacrifices in Jerusalem, right through Daniel 11 and the battles between the king of the north, the king of the south over Jerusalem. And then you come to the last verse of Daniel. And it mentions Jerusalem, not by name, but it's there. Go thy way, says Daniel's told, to the end, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. Thy lot, thy inheritance lot, is what it means. Thy lot, thy plot of land. The inheritance that Daniel will have. Now, Daniel was a prince of Judah. Where do you think his lot's going to be? Right in the region of Jerusalem. So the whole prophecy centres upon Jerusalem, and the prophecies and time periods we're going to be talking about relate to what happens in Jerusalem. And unfortunately, what happens in Jerusalem for centuries now, and on many occasions prior, has to do with the desecration of the Temple Mount Jerusalem, of the temple. And the Arabs are using the term, the Palestinians are using the term desecration. They're going against Israel because of the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Well, actually, what that's telling us is, have a look at the prophecies about the desecration of the Temple Mount. And it's going to come to an end. Now, I can't tell you for sure that it's going to come to an end right now, but everything's pointing towards it. Now, the wonderful thing that we have, brothers and sisters, is this great book by Brother Thomas, The Exposition of Daniel. And I hope we've all read it, and if you haven't yet, some of the young people mightn't have got through it yet. Exposition of Daniel. Please, get it out. Get your dictionary alongside some of the words. Maybe even get your atlas to look at some of the old-time names of places over in the Middle East. But this is the book that tells us the times in which we live. And Brother Thomas gave us all the clues. Every foundation clue is there in the Exposition of Daniel to know about the time of the end, the times in which we live. So we're going to be unlocking the time periods of Daniel chapter 4, chapter 8 and chapter 12, all about our days, 1917 to 2023 in particular, and events that have happened during that time period. And we won't be looking at the prophecy of the 70 weeks because that's the time leading up unto the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's long ago. There's another time period, by the way, which has happened in the time of the end, which isn't in Daniel, but it gives us a definite period of time that ended last year, just over a year ago. Does anybody know what that is? 70 years from the death of the Queen. That's right. Isaiah chapter 23 very definitely told us the Queen would reign for 70 years. A monarch on the throne of Tyre or Tarshish, which of course is in the modern day is Great Britain, and that a ruler would reign for 70 years. And it happened. And then we're told that Britain will grow economically and be ready to bring all of their goods, all of their treasures, to the feet of the Lord Jesus Christ. They will be for those who dwell before Yahweh, says Isaiah chapter 23. So our time is right, isn't it? We're right on the time. Now, the time of the end, we said, Daniel asks, how long? And we did say that our title tonight, this afternoon, is that the wise shall understand. That's there in verse 10. The wise will understand. Now, it's quite understandable to realise that a lot of people haven't been able to pick up on the time periods, and I don't think I really did until a few years ago. But a lot of people haven't been able to pick up on these things because we weren't in, the position to be able to forecast. Now we can look back. Now, we read in Ezekiel a couple of days ago, Ezekiel says to the elders, or God tells Ezekiel to tell the elders, when what you have prophesied has happened, then they'll know there's a prophet among you. Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses says, when the prophet prophesies things that come to pass, you know he's a prophet. Well, now we know, because things have come to pass, that we are in the time of the end. We couldn't really tell that until we could see the fulfilment of these time periods. And that's why the third last verse of Daniel chapter 12 says, when we get to that time, the seal will be opened and people can understand, because they can look back and say, yes, we can see when it started. We can see what that's talking about. We can understand the terms used and we can see when it ended. We are in the time of the end. Yes, we are. And that's, not any great credit to anybody foretelling things, but looking back and saying, yes, this is what happened. And it did take that period of time that Daniel told us it would, or that the angels told Daniel it would. So we're not putting out anything new here. These are things that have happened, and we can see now they have happened. Now, if the Lord doesn't return in 2023, I think by the time we get to a few years afterwards, we'll look back and say, that was the thing that happened in 2023. Because we didn't see what happened in 1978 that I'm going to be talking about shortly until long after the event. And we look back and say, that's what happened. We weren't excited about it as a brotherhood at the time, but now we can look back and say, that all fits into place. So this is the time that we're in when things are fitting into place. As we said, Daniel's prophecies all centre on Jerusalem, the sanctuary, the holy city, the first verse and the very last verse. Now, we're going to be concentrating on these time periods which have puzzled people for a long time, but it's all clear now, okay? And I think you'll all agree, once we've been through this, how clear this is now. these periods of time that we read of in Daniel chapter 12. We'll look at those in a moment, but we need to give ourselves context to show how it is definite that we are in the time of the end, and therefore we need to look at two other time periods in the Bible, in particular the 2,520 days, or the 7 years or 7 times, 2,520 days, which ended in 1917, and the 2,300 days, which was the time from Alexander the Great to 1967, that also says this is going to happen in the time of the end. So let's have a look at it. Brother Thomas says, we won't read it from the book, Exposition of Daniel, but there it is, in this section, page 74. The time of the end is the period. Okay, it's not just a very brief brief moment in time, it's a period of the opening and unsealing of the words of the book, so that it may speak intelligibly to the wise who will understand. The opening and unsealing is effected by the events of the time being an unmistakable fulfilment. That's what we're saying here. Unmistakable how these things have worked out, so that every one of the wise cannot fail to understand. Let's all be among the wise. Now, Daniel 11 verse 40, the king of the north is pushed at by the king of the south. And Brother Thomas tells us what that is, and he wrote this in book was published in 1868. He wrote this in advance, knowing these are the signs. He couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. As a matter of fact, he did go close. He did have one date that he put out there saying 1908, I think it's going to happen. And that would have been 40 years after he died, but it was actually a bit later than that, so 1917. He says this, he understands, the time of the end has the beginning and the ending. In yellow, its approach is marked by an event connected with Egypt, and its ending by a consummation connected with Israel. So he's talking in Egypt in verse 40 of Daniel 11, and 45, when the palace is placed in the glorious holy mountain, when Russia plants itself in the glorious holy mountain, but he comes to his end. Same word as verse 40, time of the end, Russia comes to its end. So he says, it ends by a consummation connected with Israel being in the land, and of course the kingdom being established. So he says, at the time of the end, the king of the south pushes him, is for the Egyptian power to attack. This attack then upon the Ottoman regime by the person who's in charge of Egypt, which turned out to be Britain and its allies in 1917 in World War I. The attack upon the Ottoman regime, that is Turkey. The Turks were driven out by the ruler of Egypt from the south. That begins the time of the end. It's the approach of the time of the end. Brother Thomas was spot on. So we are living in the time of the end, and we have been for a long time, but it's the Bible's time of the end. Let's not concern ourselves that it ought to be brief. It's a lengthy period of time, and I'll make a bit more comment on that later on. So the time of the end, there's the wonderful photograph of General Allenby marching in, leading the British into the city of Jerusalem. It began the opening and unsealing of the words of the book that the angel said to Daniel, wait a while, it'll unseal itself when we're ready. Here we are. Now Daniel chapter 4 is about the great tree of Nebuchadnezzar's dream that was cut down. If we go back to Daniel chapter 4, I'm just going to mention a few verses from there. But I think we probably remember this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and he called all his wise men. They couldn't tell him the meaning, but Daniel said, you are the great tree, and it's going to be hewn down, and 7 times will pass over you until what's called, notice this, the end of the days. So this prophecy and dream also has to do with the end of the days. So when it finishes, it's the time of the end. Verse 34, which is there, Nebuchadnezzar says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. It's the same expression as the last verse of Daniel chapter 12. You'll stand in your lot at the end of the days. So this prophecy has to do with this time of the end period, the end of days. Now, remember, Nebuchadnezzar is told that this 7 times will pass over him. when we talk about a time or times in Bible prophecy terms, how long is a time? It's a year. Okay, it's a year. A time is a year. Times, when it's mentioned as plural, is 2 years. How long is a year in the Hebrew lunar calendar? 30 days in the month, 360. You okay with that? So 7 times is 7 times 360. Now, just before I go to the next slide, there's also another period of 7 times mentioned about Israel. Israel being punished for their iniquity. And it's in Leviticus chapter 26, and I'm not going to turn to that right now, but keep a note of Leviticus chapter 26, where Israel are told, if you transgress my laws, if you become totally disobedient, I will punish you 7 times for your iniquity. And in Leviticus 26, the words are mentioned 4 times. I will punish you 7 times. 4 times it's mentioned in that chapter. In Daniel chapter 4, 4 times. We've got Nebuchadnezzar being told 7 times will pass over you. So you can relate these 2 times. One for the punishment of Israel, one for the kingdom of men to prevail. That's what happens. Israel goes down, kingdom of men comes up for 7 times. So 7 times is the time period of the kingdom of men, and that relates to 7 times 360, 2,520 years on the day for a year principle. So the Jewish people are downtrodden. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 26, we're told, God tells them, I will destroy your sanctuary for that period of time. Well, that's what actually happens. Brother Thomas says in Exposition of Daniel, these are the times of the kingdom of Babylon on the one hand, 2,520 years, and the down times of the kingdom of Judah, 2,520 years. So Israel will be suppressed and the Gentiles will be on top for 7 times. So Brother Thomas says 2,520 days are prophetically equal to the same number of solar years. So they become then solar years when you're interpreting the prophecy, and on it goes to the end of the Babylonish kingdom of men. 7 times, says Brother Thomas, to Israel's suppression, and 7 times to the kingdom of men prevailing. So the kingdom of Israel came to its end, and the kingdom of men began with Nebuchadnezzar. There, of course, are the Babylonians smashing the brazen pillars of the temple, setting fire to the temple, and the children of Israel going into captivity. Terrible times. 7 times shall pass over thee, we're told, Nebuchadnezzar is told. But there's left there a band of iron and brass as the tree stump is in the ground. Now, only a year after the dream is given, Nebuchadnezzar has actually overthrown Jerusalem. The temple has been burnt, the people have been taken into captivity, and he's looking out there upon his city saying, this is great Babylon that I built for the honour of my power, for the honour of my majesty, for my pride. And God says, hew the tree down and leave a stump with bands of iron and brass. What's the iron represent in the book of Daniel and the visions? The power of Rome, yeah. Brass was Greece. And of course, the world became, after the Grecian Empire declined, it still became the Greco-Roman world. Heard that expression? The Greco-Roman world. So there's iron and brass. Greek philosophy, Roman politics, and power, expanding the empire. Anybody hear about this? Anybody hear about this? Only a week or so ago, when the world was shocked by the chopping down of a great sycamore tree over in England. Now, why am I putting it up there? Because if we are following our scriptures and understanding our Bible, we would know that that's very relevant for us to think about Daniel chapter 4. Because you know what kind of a tree that was? That was a sycamore tree. A sycamore fig tree. And, you know, in Daniel chapter 4, we're not told what kind of a tree it is, but it's got all the characteristics of a sycamore tree. A sycamore tree grows very, very tall, and it's probably the tallest tree in the world that actually carries edible fruit. Okay, a sycamore tree has not the very best of figs. It's a wild fig tree, and it has fruit just about all year round. When in Daniel chapter 4, the message goes forth, cut down the tree and scatter the fruit, and all the animals that are under that tree and the birds in the tree can go away, because they all were feeding on the fruits of the tree. Over in Africa, where sycamores grow quite a lot, it's Africa and the Middle East, elephants eat from the sycamore tree. Giraffes can reach up almost to the top of the sycamore tree. That this one was 100 foot high and 300 years old. Apes can eat from the sycamore tree. Rhinos eat from the sycamore tree. Lots of birds eat from the sycamore tree. And that's the kind of tree that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, that he was the great power. But it does say, cut the tree down and just leave the stump. What have they done there? They've cut the tree down and left the stump. It's incredible, isn't it? But more incredible is this. That tree, when it was cut down, straddles the wall built by the Romans, Hadrian. And it represented the far western border of the Roman Empire. The band of iron, we might say. The iron and the brass band. It's right at the fringe of that. And I think God's telling us, he told the world, have a think about the fact that the kingdom of men is coming to an end. That's why that's been on our news, for us. Oh, the world's outraged that the tree's gone down, and I don't blame them at all. But the very fact that it's on everybody's news bulletins recently is telling us the tree's cut down, the kingdom of men is coming to an end. I think that's remarkable. Don't you? So God gives us little signals from time to time. Here it is. Nebuchadnezzar is punished for 7 years. The 7 times passes over thee till thou know the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Now, the God in heaven reveals secrets, and again, this prophecy in Daniel chapter 2 says in verse 28, this is all about the latter days. Also called in Daniel, the time of the end, the latter days. Now remember in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, having seen that vision, sets up a similar vision, but all of gold. He sees himself as the entire image of gold, and what we're being told from that is that all the kingdoms of men are Babylonish in character. Without going into the book of Revelation, we know that in the final analysis it's going to be a battle between the great golden image of Babylon, papal Babylon, battling with the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, Daniel's 3 friends were put in the furnace that was heated 7 times hotter. So again, we're being told, look at this as being significant and symbolic of the time of the kingdom of men. It's a Babylonish kingdom of men. It's a Greco-Roman kingdom of men politically. It's a Babylonish kingdom of men religiously. So when do we start this 7 times period? Brother Thomas had a good hard look at it, and he said in Daniel, he said, I don't think it's the time, doesn't begin with the cutting down of the image, of the tree rather. I don't think that's what it's talking about. It's talking about the whole period of God's view of the kingdom of men. And that started, says Brother Thomas, close to the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. In Daniel, in chapter 2, where the image is revealed, we read that this all happened in the 2nd year, Daniel 2 verse 1, of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar began in the latter part of 605 BC, coming on close to 604. So the 2nd year is 603 BC. That's when God said, you are the head of gold. And that then marked the beginning of the kingdoms of men as far as Bible prophecy is concerned. So if we take 603 BC and add 2520, okay, you've got 603 before the point dot 0, and on from there we go to 1917, which is Daniel 11 verse 40, isn't it? The king of the south pushed the king of the north, which was the Ottoman Empire, out of Jerusalem. The Turks were pushed out. The kingdom of men continues as the Greco-Roman world until 1917. That's the beginning of the times of the end. And as far as Israel was concerned, Israel were also subject to that 2,520-year period, the 7 times, and Israel was scattered and persecuted from that time, and the sanctuary was overspread with desolations, as Leviticus 26, words from Leviticus 26, again until 1917. What happened in 1917? Well, it was the beginning of the time of the end. And as we've said, there are a number of time periods that all come to pass from Daniel in the time of the end. Firstly, the 1917 25-20 days, 7 times. Then we're going to see from chapter 12 this first period of 1260 days. Then we go back to Daniel chapter 8 and we see the 2300 days from the time of Alexander the Great, ends in 1967. Then we come back to Daniel 12 and look at the 1290 and the 1335 days. All right. I'm sure these slides are going to be available to you later on. Ask Brother Bobby, he'll have it all under control. All those events have to do with the fulfilment of the hope of Israel in our time. So in 1917, the Ottomans were pushed out. In 1948, the end of the scattering, as we'll see from the words of Daniel chapter 12. Jerusalem is no longer trodden down, which is mentioned in Daniel chapter 8 about the treading down of the people of Israel, and Jesus takes it up in Luke 21 and says Jerusalem will no longer be trodden down of the Gentiles after 1967. Then from 1978 we'll see the critical year which began the process of giving the Jewish people access to the Temple Mount again to worship after a whole long period of time, 1,290 years. And Daniel it stands in his lot in 2023, the 1335 days. We don't know that it's actually going to happen right at this very year, but we might look back, as I said, in a couple of years and say, that was the significance of 2023. 1917 begins the time of the end, and the king of the south pushed at him. Millions of people died in World War I, we know that, but World War I was fought to open the way to Jerusalem so that the Jews could return. All the other things that happened in World War I really led to that point in 1917. And the Balfour Declaration, which came out a matter of days after the British took control of Jerusalem, where Lord Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild saying that His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Israel. So 1917, 20 days, 1967, 2300 days, the end of the trampling underfoot of the city of Jerusalem, and the beginning of the events which will see eventually the removal of the abomination of desolation from the Temple Mount. Daniel chapter 8, just to briefly run through that, to give us some context here again, that this is to do with the time of the end, and that we're in all these periods, the things that are fulfilling in this time period. We know that we've got the ram and the he-goat, and the he-goat on the left there with the sharp horn between his eyes comes and battles with the ram. The ram was the Medo-Persian Empire. You can see on the ram on the right there, one horn a bit higher than the other. The Persians became more powerful, and that represented to us the battle of Alexander the Great, who came to overthrow the Medo-Persian Empire. And from that period of time, the rough goat, Daniel 8:21, is him, that's Alexander the Great. From that period of time, 2,300 days until Jerusalem would be in the hands of the Jews once again. So Alexander there on the left, Darius III on the right, and the only time that they met in battle was in 333 BC. Some have suggested it might have been the Battle of Granicus, which was a bit to the west of our circle there, where Alexander first did battle with the Medo-Persians, but the king wasn't there. Darius wasn't in that battle. He was in the battle of 333 BC, a year later. So we can take that as the time, because Daniel tells us the kings fight one another. So the two kings are in battle. in the Battle of Issus, and Alexander defeated Darius III, and we know that after Alexander died, the empire was divided amongst his 4 generals, and there's that little horn there we can see which grows out of the territory of one of those generals and becomes centred in Constantinople. So the king of the north, there shown as the Seleucus Empire, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, the king of the south in Egypt. The little horn eventually takes over the whole of the area of the king of the north and centres it in Constantinople, 312 AD, when Constantine became the ruler, king of the north in Constantinople. So we're up to 312 AD. 333 BC, Darius is defeated. Alexander, the little horn of the east, we're told in Daniel chapter 8, treads down the host and the sanctuary underfoot. That's what Jesus quotes in Luke chapter 21, when he says Jerusalem will be trodden down. And in 1967, Jerusalem is no longer trodden down of the Gentiles. Have a look again there in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 17, where we're told that it's about the time of the end. Our time. This prophecy is pointing to the time of the end, which began in 1917. So, verse 17, he came near where I stood. This is Daniel 8. When he came, I was afraid and fell on my face, but he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." Well, it started not long after Daniel's time, maybe 200 odd years after Daniel's time, but it's talking about the time of the end, when the sanctuary is no longer trodden down. That's the focus of that dream and of that vision. So, pretty exciting times. How long shall be the vision? Verse 14, 2,300 days, the time of the end. Verse 18, Daniel says, I was in a deep sleep when all this was given to me, but I was told to stand upright, time of resurrection, isn't it? That's the time of the end. And when he says in verse 19, Daniel is told, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, the last end of God's anger upon the nations, for at the time appointed the end shall be. So God is getting ready to pour out the last end of his indignation. So Daniel 8 and Luke 21 both speak about the time of period which ended in the end of the times of the Gentiles, 1967, that is the end of the times of Gentile control over Jerusalem, and Israel has got sovereignty over Jerusalem, and it's yet to be worked out more fully. Strange thing happened in 1967. Everybody expected that with Jerusalem coming into the hands of the Jews, that they would take full control of the city. But that didn't actually happen, because Moshe Dayan, when some of his troops put up a flag right there on the Temple Mount, he said, pull it down, it's too soon, it'll start a whole conflagration in the Middle East. And the debate is still on amongst Jewish people, did he do the right thing then or didn't he? Well, in God's plan, it wasn't quite the time of the end. Because how many people have come into the truth since 1967? We were baptised in 1967, only a few months after that Six-Day War. That was a tremendous turning point for the Brotherhood, actually. For a long period of time thereafter, people excited about the fact that Jerusalem is back in the hands of the Jews. But sometimes we get a bit weary. We shouldn't, because things are happening every day. Every day. We're getting closer and closer, very, very close. Now, so 1967, if the Jews had kept control of the Temple Mount, the abomination that maketh desolate might well have been destroyed at that time, but it hasn't been. It's yet to happen. So what is the abomination that maketh desolate? Well, the abomination that maketh desolate in Daniel is mentioned on 3 occasions. The abomination that maketh desolate. And it's a real thing. It's a fact. It's a situation where people can't worship on God's holy mountain because there is something there in the way. There is something there that is abominable. And therefore, worshippers feel desolate that they can't go up and worship God as they should. It's an abomination that makes people feel empty because they haven't got a place to worship. And this is what happened. In Daniel 11 verse 31, the first mention has to do with Antiochus Epiphanes, which I'll briefly talk about in a moment. They'll pollute the sanctuary of strength. Daniel 11 is about the history really from through the Medo-Persians and through to the Romans and to the time of Christ. A lot of that period is mentioned in there historically. And Antiochus Epiphanes seems to pop up fairly large in that period of time because he's a person who desecrated the temple. Then in Daniel chapter 9, we have AD 70, which is, of course, the one that the Lord Jesus Christ referred to when he said, you read the book of Daniel, make sure you understand what it's talking about. You'll see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. When you see that happen, flee to the mountains. Now that's the Romans coming in and desecrating the temple. That's an abomination. And then, in Daniel chapter 11, 12 and verse 11, we come to the period 688, which I'll show you, has to do with the beginning of the 1,290 days. And that's the great golden dome that sits in Jerusalem right now. So in Daniel 11 verse 31, Antiochus Epiphanes captured Jerusalem. When he captured Jerusalem, he put a statue of, just to show that he conquered the Jews, put a statue of the god Zeus right in the temple and killed a pig and offered swine's flesh on the altar in the temple. Horrendous stuff. You can imagine. He basically being as nasty as he can be to the Jewish people by doing all of this. And of course they couldn't worship there. The place became unclean, unholy, polluted. And however, that only lasted for 3 years. Then along came the Maccabees and pushed out Antiochus Epiphanes' forces, and they reconsecrated the temple, and that began the feast which is still celebrated today, the Feast of Hanukkah, which we can talk more about another time. But that's still celebrated every year, the reconsecration of the temple in 164 BC, 3 years after Antiochus Epiphanes had done what he'd done. Now, Jesus, in Matthew 24, the Olivet prophecy says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, of course he's not talking about Antiochus, he's talking about the Romans coming in now and destroying the temple worship then flee to the mountains. And then, Daniel 12 verse 11, an abomination that makes desolate is set up for a long period of time, making it impossible for the Jews to worship on the Temple Mount. So, 167, Antiochus, 167 BC, offers the swine. AD 70, temple destroyed by the Romans. AD 688, the Dome of the Rock is set up. A desecration that makes worship at the temple site impossible. So, there was no, from 167 BC, the abomination that maketh desolate was only there for 3 years. Okay? Stopped worship there for 3 years. AD 70, from AD 70 to 688, when the foundations of the Dome of the Rock were actually put in place, there were still Jews in the land and they still were able to worship there spasmodically. Not all the time. Some groups still went up and worshipped there. But from 688, when the Dome of the Rock was set up, no Jew was allowed to go and worship on the Temple Mount. So here's our 3 periods. The 1260 days. Let's have a look at it in Daniel chapter 12. And here we are given the end date. When Daniel asks, he says, how long shall it be to the end? Okay? Again, we're talking here, time of the end. Same words, the end. And I heard the man who was clothed in linen upon the waters of the river, this symbolic angelic being, representing perhaps the saints in glory, but we won't go into the great detail of that. It's the man of sign who holds up his hand, his right hand and his left hand. By the way, at times, angels or prophets hold up their hand as a sign that something important is going to be said. This time it's both hands, his right hand and his left hand. This is really important. because it's talking about the time when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, and all these things shall be finished. Words accomplished and finished are the same. They mean coming to an end. The scattering's coming to an end. Everything is going to be finished in this time frame. And what does it say? For time, times and a half. And we know that, as we said, we've got a period here of 360 plus 720 plus another 180. That equals 1260. Now, it's not to do with the 1260 period in Revelation. This is about this particular important prophecy about the desecration of the Temple Mount and the return of the Jews to their land. So, it's time, times and a half. Now, when we know, all we're given there really is, we're given in that verse the end date. We know when it's going to end. It's going to end after a period of time of 1260 year days. We know it finished in 1948 because that's the time when the Jews can no longer be scattered. They've now got a homeland. It's 1948. Now, when I was looking at this first back in 2019, so we're talking 4 years ago now, November came up and I was to give the word of exhortation at Bullaroo, and the reading was Daniel chapter 12. And I thought to myself, I have got to try and get to the bottom of this. It was a challenge. I didn't start with any foregone conclusion. Okay, there's an end date. There's an end date there that is 1948. It has to be. So let's count back. What do we get to? 688. And I thought, isn't that about the time of the Dome of the Rock? Well, what happened then? Was that something to do with the Muslims? Well, it's the accepted date for the foundation being laid and the construction commencing on the Dome of the Rock. It finished in about 692, but it started in 688. Could people of Israel worship between 688 and 692? No, they couldn't. As soon as that foundation was laid, they couldn't go anywhere near it. So it had to be 688. Now, I'm not, as I say, not claiming any particular knowledge or anything like that. It's just a matter of working it out. And I'm not saying this in any artificial way. I'm just saying that's how the only year it could be is 1948. It has to be 1260 back from there. It has to be the Dome of the Rock. Well, then you go to the next one, and this is what convinces you. You go to the next one, and the next period is 1290, and you're given the beginning date. You're given the start date. There it is in verse 11. In verse 11, we're told the start date, 1290. There it is, from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. Something's set up. Something set up that is an abomination that makes worship at the temple site impossible. That happened in 688. So you've immediately got a marriage of these numbers. It's incredible. So there shall be from there 1,290 days. Now the 1335 days, which is mentioned next, you're not given a start date or an end date. Not given either. But what you are told is, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. We're not told when it starts, but it's implied very clearly. Wait a bit longer after the 1290. We're told to wait till then. So the end date is accomplished to scatter the people of Israel. We know the words from Jeremiah 31, he that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. All these things are finished. It's got to be 1948. When was it no longer possible to scatter the Jewish people? 1948. There it is. So we're given the event that marks the end, not the start. In the first instance there in verse 7, we're given the end. He's accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. Is the end. The beginning must be 688. There it is. Now the second one, the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate, set up. Set up means established. You could say built if you like. It's set up, it's established in its place. for 1,290 days. It doesn't say until. Some people have interpreted it this way, oh well, it must end in 688. No, the time period begins in 688. You must have two things happen: daily sacrifice taken away and abomination set up. And Brother Thomas puts in his book on page 120, Exposition of Daniel, must they both happen at the same time? No. The text doesn't require that they should. So there can be a time from the daily sacrifice being taken away till the abomination of desolation is set up. And that's actually what's happened. So over that period of time, the daily sacrifice is eventually taken away, largely in AD 70, but sacrifices did continue until 688. And then the 1290 days starts. The process of taking away sacrifices and establishing the abomination lasted from 70 AD to 688 AD, and then the 1290 days could begin. I won't read that to you, but that's from Wikipedia, talking about the fact that people did go up and offer sacrifices, traditional sacrifices, on the Temple Mount until the practice effectively ended when the Dome of the Rock was built. Construction commenced, the abomination set up, 688. Just to show you, we've often thought, well, the Jews were all scattered in 688. No, sorry, in AD 70. We've talked in those terms. But Benjamin Netanyahu, who gave this interview some few months ago now, points out that historically the Jews weren't finally scattered until the Arabs came in and overran the land in the time of Muhammad and soon after, and then built at the end of the 7th century, which of course is the 600s, the Dome of the Rock. Just have a listen if we can get this going.
So the Bible describes how the Jewish people lived on this land, were attached to this land, fought off conquerors, sometimes were conquered, but stayed on their land. And that continued for a very long time until roughly the 7th century actually, after the birth of Christ, okay? We were conquered by the Romans, we were conquered by the Byzantines. They did a lot of bad things to us, but they didn't really exile us, contrary to what people think, okay? The loss of our land actually occurred when the Arab conquest took place in the 7th century. The Arabs burst out from Arabia, and they did something that no other conqueror, not the Romans, not the Byzantines, not the Greeks before them, not Alexander the Great, nobody did before. They actually started taking over the land of the Jewish farmer. Though it is under the Arab conquest that the Jews lost their homeland.
You said the Arabs came in the 7th century, and that's a long time ago, and so from the 7th century to now...
The Jews were dispossessed, we were flung to the far corners of the earth, suffered unimaginable suffering because we had no homeland. But we didn't disappear, and we never gave up the dream of coming back to our ancestral homeland. And they said, next year in Jerusalem, we'll come back next year in Jerusalem.
So there you are. Benjamin Netanyahu reinforces what we're saying, that the end of the sacrifices and the scattering of the Jews to their land didn't really come fully into effect until the end of the 7th century. 688 was, of course, the time of the Abomination of Desolation being set up. Okay, so for 1290 days, from 688, that beginning time, which is established for us there in verse 11 of Daniel 12, we come to 1978. 1290 days. The start date, the abomination that desolation is set up, the Dome of the Rock commences, and we come to 1978. Now, what happened in 1978? We were interested in this as a brotherhood, but did we really understand what happened in 1978? 1978, you can see there the President of Egypt, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Camp David Accords. And that's the first time that peace came about between Israel and one of the Arab nations around them. And the world saw it and gave Sadat and Begin the Nobel Peace Prize for coming to that peaceful arrangement. The world noticed it. Why didn't we see how significant 1978 was? Well, it's even more significant than simply the first peace agreement. that there has been no war between Egypt and Israel, the Camp David Accords tried to address the question of Jerusalem and worship at Jerusalem, but when the text finally came out, Jerusalem wasn't actually mentioned in the text of the agreement. But here I did some pretty heavy research and found that when you look through all the documents related to the Camp David Accords, there were also letters that passed between the leaders while they were holed up there in Camp David, and Jimmy Carter wouldn't let them go until they made an agreement. Because he wanted that to be the hallmark of his presidency, which it probably was. But between them, they're over there in one of the cabins at Camp David is Sadat and his crowd, and there's Begin and his crowd and another one, and letters passed between them via the President Carter. And in one letter on the 17th of September 1978, Anwar Sadat addressed the situation of Jerusalem. And there are 7 points mentioned there, but the key one for us is point number 5. All peoples must have free access to the city and enjoy the free exercises of worship and the right to visit and transit to the holy places without distinction or discrimination. Fancy an Arab leader putting that forward, agreeing with that. The first Muslim ever to say, yes, the Jews should be able to go up to the Temple Mount. That's what he's saying there. Everybody should be able to go to all the holy places. After all, it's the holy places, the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians, they all should be able to go there. That's what he's saying. Now, that hasn't been put into effect totally yet, but that was the beginning of the end for the abomination of desolation. That's the beginning of allowing the Jews to go back and worship on the Holy Mount in 1978. But what are we being told about the 1335 days? Wait another 45 years for it all to come to pass. Here, just well, it's actually 2 years ago now, is a great little video about the Jewish people going up to the Holy Mount. The Jordanians are in charge of the they call it Al-Aqas, but of the Temple Mount, and the Jews haven't been allowed to go up much until more recently. And I believe that in the last 12 months, 50,000 Jews have gone up. Weren't quite that many in 2021, but have a listen to this little video.
Extraordinary is that we are praying on the Temple Mount, facing the place of the Holy Temple. It's extraordinary because, as I said a couple of years ago, we would have all been arrested for doing this. It's extraordinary because for 2,000 years Jews couldn't do this. It's extraordinary because we've made it this far. We're this close. After the silent prayer, the prayer leader repeats the prayer out loud, and we all answer Amen at the appropriate places. That's what we're doing right now. As you see, people praying and people reciting verses from Tanakh, from the Hebrew Scriptures. Again, any of this until a couple of years ago, you'd be stopped by the police, taken off the mount, taken in for questioning, maybe for a few hours, and distanced from the mount, maybe for months. We've made a lot of progress. We have a lot more progress to make. And we're making this progress because people are going up, Jews are going up to the Temple Mount, and in larger and larger numbers, and insisting, and not being silent.
Okay, everybody take a deep breath because we've got a few more minutes to go. Okay, so that's telling us what's happening. It's the beginning of the end, 1978, when there was first the agreement that Jews should be able to go up, says President Anwar Sadat. Now, not many of his people were happy with him saying that because the evidence was that he was assassinated not too long after saying that. He was getting too friendly to Israel. But that was the first time a Muslim leader said, others can go up to worship on that mount. That's the beginning, and that's really what Daniel's telling us here. You've got to wait. That's the beginning. Wait another 45 years. Now, I won't go through this video, but I think most of us know this is the right-wing and quite religious co-leader of the Israeli government at the present time, and he's saying the Temple Mount is there for everybody. So, 1260 days, no more scattering of the Jews. 1290 days, the Dome of the Rock Abomination is coming to an end, and 1335. And if you can read the small print there, I'm saying, not giving us a start date or an end date. Are we being tricked? Is there some sort of a guessing game going on here as to what this 1335 means? You talk to anyone in the churches, they haven't got a clue. They guess here, they guess that, they guess something else. No idea. But really, we just need to read carefully what the text is saying. And the Bible language is pretty clear. Blessed is he who waits a little bit longer than 1290 and comes to 1335, the time of the end. The wise will understand. So, Exposition of Daniel, Brother Thomas says on page 120 in his book, he says, this is really clear, I only really discovered that, it's only a half a sentence, but it's there where he says the 1335 years have an epochal beginning in common with the 1290. What does that mean? An epochal beginning is there, the 1290 and the 1335 start there, 1290 finishes here, 1335 finishes there from that same start date. An epochal beginning, they're the same. So, what we've been saying is that we've got the 1290 days in 1978, we've got 1335 days 45 years later, which just happens to be right now. So, we wait for that extra period of time, 2023. This is a hugely significant year, and as I said, we mightn't fully appreciate it until a little bit later on. We're almost at the end of the year, or it might happen before the end of the year, that the events which bring about the end of the time of the end of the Dome of the Rock, come about. We don't know exactly. But Daniel is told he stands at the end of the days in his lot. Why is it taking so long? Well, God doesn't do everything abruptly. The time of the end has been going for a long time. But remember, just looking at the graphics here, the decree of Cyrus to return to the land was given in 536, and Nehemiah's great return, foreshadowed in the book of Malachi, was 106 years later. Who may abide the day of his coming? Well, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was very much like the decree of Cyrus. Jews, go back to your land. And 106 years later, here we are in 2023. I think there's great significance in that. God's taking his time, but that's the time of the end. It's a long period of time. We're fortunate. We've been called to the truth in this time, but it's going to come to its end very soon. So, blessed is he who waits to 1,305 and 30 days, which I'm quite confident is 2023. What it means in terms of the Lord Jesus Christ's return, the resurrection, we can't be sure, can we? But this is the point, what I put together on Friday night to talk about the Palestinians and Lebanon and the problem being solved in Joel chapter 3. In Joel chapter 3, just going over this is our conclusion. There's a couple of things to look at here. Joel 3, as we said from verse 4, we're in the time of Armageddon because that's, as we said, the early verses, and then taken up again in chapter 9 and chapter 11, verse 11. Joel 3, the early verses, then verse 9, 11, assemble yourselves and come. Thither cause thy mighty ones to come down, O Yahweh. Tyre and Sidon are in Lebanon, and all the coasts of Palestine. God's saying, why are you railing against me? What have you got to do with me? What's this all about? And he does say, swiftly and speedily I will return your recompense upon your own head, because you sold my children to the Grecians. This is in history. This is time gone by when the Jews were scattered. And he says, God says, the children also of Judah, verse 6, the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians. That is in the original word, that Javan, which is the area of, literally of Greece and of European countries. And the Jews were, weren't they? They were sold off into the European territories for centuries. Centuries. So God says in the latter time, he says, verse 7, I will raise them up out of the place whither ye have sold them, In other words, you had them under your control and you pushed them out of the land, and the figure is selling them. I'll bring them back from where you sold them. And of course we know many of them came back from Europe and other countries that they'd been pushed out to centuries and centuries ago. And I will return your recompense upon your own head. Returning a recompense. Well, payback. Payback is what it means. It's payback time. So in verses 4 to 8, the Lebanon and the Palestinians will be sold into the hands of the Sabaeans. I'll return your recompense. In verse 8, I'll sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah. In other words, Israel will be in control. They're so much in control, I'm told by Brother Bobby earlier on, that they've got that much control over the Gaza Strip, they can just switch off the power, and 2 million people have got no power. That's not a bad sense of control over the territory, is it? So God has sold these people into the hands of the children of Israel. Same with Lebanon. What's happened with Lebanon? Lebanon is a basket case. We remember the explosion. There it was just a few years ago. And Lebanon was already in big trouble, but this was enormous. Now Lebanon was in terrible trouble economically, and partly and largely because of their religious confusion there. Half the population is Christian, half is Muslim. Half of the Muslim are Sunni, half of them are Shiite. The Hezbollah has got control all over the place. They couldn't get anything done. France left and gave them their independence, although France wanted to continue to exercise some control. But France is really not able to control anything anymore. They've pretty well lost Africa and all the places they had colonised there. And Lebanon, they can't do anything in Lebanon either. Party factions, political paralysis. They haven't had a president since October last year. They can't agree on who should be president. The president's supposed to be a Maronite Christian. The Prime Minister's got to be a Sunni. That's still part of the deal they've got to try and run the country. The Speaker of the Parliament's got to be a Shiite. The Prime Minister is only in there as a caretaker Prime Minister because the previous one was ousted for family corruption. They really can't get anything done. The people are suffering in terrible poverty. And Israel really has got a fair say in what happens for the future of Lebanon, but they are turning a little bit towards Saudi Arabia. And I think that's what's going to happen. The caretaker Prime Minister, you can see there on the left, is keeping on friendly terms with Saudi Arabia. The party of Hezbollah, who's backed by Iran and Syria, largely in control, certainly militarily, and no political decision can be made unless they say so. And the previous president actually had a memorandum of understanding with Hezbollah, Christians with Hezbollah, to try and run the country. Impossible. So Joel chapter 3 says, "What have you got to do with me, Tyre and Sidon, and all the coast of Palestine? I will return your recompense upon your own head." And I think that's about to happen. It's payback time. What have you to do with me? I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah, that is, Israel in the land as at the moment, and they'll sell them to the Sabaeans, a people afar off, for Yahweh hath spoken it.
There's no question. The Abraham Accords heralded the dawn of a new age of peace. But I believe that we are at the cusp of an even more dramatic breakthrough, an historic peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I also believe that we must not give the Palestinians a veto over new peace treaties with Arab states.
What would it take for you to agree to normalize relations with Israel?
For us, the Palestinian issue is very important. We need to solve that part, and we have good negotiations continue till now. We gotta see where it will go. We hope that it will reach a place that it will ease the life of the Palestinians and get Israel back as a player in the Middle East.
So you think, if you were to characterize it, are you close?
Every day we get closer.
So it's very, very close. And of course, the Palestinians have seen that and thought, we've got to try and get some relevance back by firing, 7,000 rockets it was as of this morning into Israel, and a very well-organised attack. And we don't know how long that will go. But that, of course, is really acting right in the face of Saudi Arabia and saying, don't forget about us. The MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi prince, simply said, we want to ease the life of the Palestinians. He didn't mention anything about a two-state solution. And I've thought for a long time the two-state solution was dead in the water years ago. So something's got to happen where Saudi Arabia steps in here, the Sabaeans, and solves the Palestinian question. How that will be, we don't know. But then, of course, Israel will be able to dwell safely with neither bars nor gates. So what happens next? The Lord returns, the resurrection, the quick and the dead, us and the dead are gathered together to judgment. When will it be? We cannot be sure. But we do know that we are at the end of the time of the end, and that the wise will understand.